So thank you everyone for joining us today. I don't know if you can see my slide.
Yes, we also see the next one somehow.
Okay. I wonder why. Let's see how I can change that.
It's not that bad. I mean, I can still nevertheless see the main one, bigger
Okay,
form.
let's see if I can change it. No, I don't want to set that. Okay, so welcome everyone to today's webinar. We are having today Giulia Parola with us. Thank you very much, Giulia, for joining us and for being our speaker today. The topic of today is research and data literacy for impact management. I will do the intro today and we will let people join in, and then we get into the content of the topic with Giulia. I will present the rules of the webinar. Basically, the discussions will be around 90 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session. But you are very much welcome to ask us questions. We will take the questions in the chat, and then we will pass them on to Giulia. Also, you can raise hands, and we can make sure that we respond any questions you may have. The webinar is recorded, so after the session today, you will have access to the content of the webinar, so you can use it later on. And also you will receive via email the slides and the presentation of the day. Okay, as I was mentioning, Giulia is our speaker today. I will let Giulia present her experience in a few minutes. I will present shortly the SIFTA program. So basically, SIFTA is part of the Invest EU Advisory Hub, and there are a few threads of support under Invest EU. And under the social investment and skills component, you can see the window for microfinance and social enterprise finance support. This is where SIFTA program is operating. The program is managed by EIB, and it offers project advisory, capacity building and market development on one hand, and also rating, assessment, and evaluation. Basically, the program is a continuation of a previous program, EASY program, which was also focusing on technical assistance. In terms of eligibility, we have a geographical eligibility of EU 27. The program was initially implemented up until December 2024, but we are having now an extension until December 2025. And the beneficiaries are basically microfinance providers such as banks and non-bank institutions, and also social enterprise and finance providers such as investment funds, impact investors, incubators, accelerators, and so on. Okay. In terms of partners, there are, so I was mentioning the program is managed by EIB, and the technical assistance and the capacity building, it's run by Frankfurt School with MFC, EMN, and FEDEA, and the evaluation and the assessment and rating is run by MFR. In case you want to get in touch with us, you can go to eib.org to find more information on SIFTA. Also, you can write us at sifta.eib.org, and you will have to fill a request for service, and then you will be officially entering the process for becoming a beneficiary of the program. So this is very much, in short, the presentation of the program. Giulia?
Yeah, I'm gonna first start my presentation, so then we are done with the technical stuff. You let me know when you see my slides. Do you see them fine?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Rafael. So I have to start by saying that I hope Joanna and you will update the picture you had in your presentation because it's 15 years old, so I think you ought to do it.
What do you say?
Otherwise, people get disappointed. But thanks for letting me introduce myself. My name is Julia. I am project lead at the European Center for Social Finance. I'm project lead and I also teach at a university. It's actually a university of applied sciences, so it is very much linked to practice. This is Munich Business School. And then I'm also a postdoctoral researcher at the Bundeswehr University in Munich. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm originally Italian, but living in Munich now for the past 12 years. I would say my expertise lies in social impact management, which is partly linked to what I want to share with you here today. So I also must tell that the webinar takes a bit of a step back in the sense that while I'm sure you're all a bit familiar with social impact management, I actually want to talk more broadly about research and data literacy, as these are skills that you need to master or at least know very well if you are willing to manage social impact within your organization. So this is the plan I have for today. I think it's quite ambitious, but I'm also very excited because I added a lot of new stuff that I'm learning still myself. So in part one, I want to talk about why engaging with research and impact is extremely important in the microfinance field and more in general in all fields that aim to generate some sort of positive social impact in the world. I also want to take a broader look at what research is and where the key concepts come from. And that's something, as I said, I'm still new for myself as well. In part two, we really go deeper into data literacy, which means the ability to collect, manage, and evaluate and apply data in a critical manner. And then we will also look specifically at what data is. I plan to provide you with a menu, just like in a restaurant, with a series of data collection methods that you can choose and pick from when you are to manage social impact. And finally, in the last part, I want to talk about how bias can be addressed when dealing with data so that you can make the most out of your research efforts. I also want to talk a little bit about additionality, since this is something I have the feeling it very much often pops up, but we don't talk very much about what it means in practice and how you can collect data to prove it. And finally, just very briefly, what I think collaborations with research institutions might look like, and also what are the benefits of these collaborations for microfinance institutions. So as Joanna already mentioned, I'm really happy to get questions throughout the webinar. So I'm also free, like from my side, it's also okay if you want to raise your hand or if you prefer to use the chat function. I don't know if I can monitor it, but I'm sure Joanna and Jörg can help me with that. So as I said, I want to start from the very beginning. And what I always ask is, why is it important to engage with research and data? And I would argue that you can think about it by considering what happens if you don't. And I kind of developed these two scenarios. If you decide that data and research are not for you or for your organization, then I think that in the best case scenario, you're generating positive social impact, but you cannot prove it because you don't have evidence for it. And in the worst case scenario, then you're trying to do something good, but you're actually generating negative social impact and you're completely unaware that this is happening. So basically, you would keep on doing something that goes against the very mission of your organization. Now, I also brought a couple of examples of when this happens. So I do think that good intentions are usually not enough to achieve positive social impact. And I hope these slides helps you by showing a few relatively well-known examples of people and organizations that were actually trying to do something good, but they had catastrophic consequences on the people and the communities that they were trying to support. So I am sure you're at least have heard of some of these examples. One of the most famous was an anti-malaria charity giving away free mosquito nets in Africa, and because the nets were given away for free, then people started to misuse them and use them as fishing nets, and this had catastrophic consequences on the environment there, but also it actually didn't get to fight malaria, which was the whole purpose of the program. Another program giving away free things was run by Nestlé that was giving away free milk formula in Africa. So the problem was that they didn't check that actually women had access to clean water. So they were mixing the formula with bad water, with polluted water, which of course had a very bad health consequences on the infants. And then Tom's, I put it there because actually I have two pair of these shoes. Tom's was giving away a free pair of shoes in African communities for each pair of shoes purchased in the global north. The problem is that by giving away the free shoes, they completely destroy the economy of shoemakers in these communities. So I'm not going through all of these examples, but I hope that they stick with you, because I think in some, if not all of these programs, engaging with research and data would have definitely prevented some of the damage. But besides these rather famous scandals, I have a few more reasons why you should engage with research and data. And the first is definitely that it can help you check if you're indeed going towards the purpose and the goal of your organization. Even if you're going, it could give you insights in how to improve your interventions. If you notice you're actually having the opposite impact of what you want to achieve, it could also help you determining that you actually have to stop with some of your interventions. It usually also helps with resource allocation within your organization. It helps with stakeholder engagement, and this is usually done through impact reports. And in general is, let's say, a good idea because regulatory requirements are becoming more stringent over the past years. So if you wait too much, then you will be left behind. Now, so my question was also, what is the data of interest to microfinance institutions that are trying to achieve a positive social impact? And I think you can answer this question with the relatively famous input, output, and outcome impact model. Since, as I said, I think many of you have seen this model, but for the sake of clarity, I would say we go through it once at the beginning of the webinar so that then we are all on the same line when we refer to these different terms. So the model states that any activity of your organization, for example, the disbursement of microloans, requires some sort of input. For example, financial resources in the form of capital. Then the direct measurable results of these activities are called outputs. And if we continue with our example, this would be, for example, the number of microloans you have disbursed in the past year. Outcomes instead refer to the direct effects of your outputs on the target group. So for instance, hopefully an increase in income levels of your clients. And finally, impact refers to the broader effects, for example, the positive effects that you are having beyond your target group, for example, on their families or on a community. So here the assumption is that outcomes and impacts are changing as a consequence of your outputs. Now, the issue, however, is that as we move to the right-hand side of my slide, it becomes more and more difficult to measure. And that is also why most organizations, and I can also put microfinance institutions in this group, they really usually stop at outputs. So usually you're able to tell how many loans you have disbursed, for example, or how many hours of training. But just knowing this, it doesn't tell you anything about the effects of the loans or the training on your target groups, or even on broader groups like communities. So I hope you understand that measuring outputs is needed. It's probably something you're already doing, but it doesn't tell you enough.
איראן כן انجت outputs برو خصمان انا میاد
I think somebody is unmuted. So this is why in evaluation research, we actually want to move beyond outputs, and that's why the slides hopefully communicates that, as we want to collect data and also analyze it, of course, and this is specifically outcome and impact data. And what I want to talk to you about today, especially in the second part of the webinar, is exactly how to collect data regarding outcome and impact. So before we talk about the specifics and the technicalities, however, as I mentioned before, I wanted to take a step back and see where the principles we use in research and data collection come from, because I think that many researchers, and I am one of them, have made some relevant considerations when it comes to deciding what data we want, how we want to collect it and handle it, and especially how we want to approach getting the data we need from the people we are serving. And what I can tell you is that there are two main paradigms in research, the Euro-Western and the indigenous research paradigm. And I know that indigenous is a very contested term, but for the sake of today and this context, I refer to native people of lands that have been colonized by settlers from elsewhere. So usually people in the global north are often surprised that indigenous research and its strategies and methods predates Euro-Western research by 10 of thousands of years. So today I'm not here to tell you that indigenous research is better. I'm also not going to present you methods from indigenous research because I'm not an indigenous researcher, and also usually these are methods that are really embedded in their local context, and therefore they're not available for us to take, select, and move around. However, I decided to talk about this because I thought that we can learn something from indigenous research nevertheless. If you're interested in indigenous methods, I have added one to the slide. It's also on hyperlink, so you are free then when you receive the slide deck to explore it further. And there are plenty of books I can also recommend on indigenous methods in case you're interested in. But as I said, that's not something really we're going to explore in detail today. So what I think we can do instead is discussing some of the principles of ethical research in the indigenous paradigm, since I believe we can learn a lot from them, especially since we work mostly with vulnerable communities. In general, the Euro-Western and the indigenous principle of ethical research have a lot in common. In the slide, you see only the differences, which I try to emphasize. And so what's important for me is that you know that in the West, when we do research, the main principle is really doing no harm to our participants. And with this overarching principle, we have then some practical implications. For example, we need to minimize any risks associated to participating in the research for our participants. We also need usually to get their informed consent, so they have to agree to participate in research. What we also do usually, and in some universities or in all Western universities, I would say it's mandatory, you need to guarantee either the participants' anonymity or their confidentiality. And finally, more in general, you will need to comply with the law and any other ethical guidelines and standards. This is usually, of course, more relevant in universities where we have ethical committees, but you might be interested in having ethical guidelines on your own. Now, what I wanted to emphasize here is that although these principles, I think, are of course very well intentioned, there are some problems that I'm gonna talk about. And the first is the principle of, or the concept of informed consent. As I said, informed consent is that your participants, so the people you're collecting the data from, and in our context, probably these are gonna be your borrowers or the people involved in your microfinance programs. They will have to agree to being part of an evaluation of your services. Now, the thing with informed consent is that nowadays the internet is a fact of life, and it also has enabled people to do all sorts of things with research data, findings, outputs, and it's very difficult to predict what will be done with the data. And since we cannot really predict it, especially we cannot predict the nature of the reuse, then what are exactly participants consenting to? It's really difficult to tell nowadays. Also, another reason to question the principle is that sometimes informed consent is only a myth because participants don't really have the options to say no. And I'm gonna give you an example. Is outside probably of the microfinance sector, but nevertheless, I thought it would do the trick. I recall a study now, I'm not sure about the authors or where it was published, but researchers were evaluating the hiring process of an organization. And so what the organization did was that it granted them permission to observe the job interviews, which makes completely sense. And the candidates were asked for their informed consent. Basically, they were asked if they agreed to being observed during the job interview. And of course, they all agreed. And if you think of it, how could somebody in a job interview tell a potential employer that they don't want others in the room? It's basically not going to happen. So in this case, and especially in certain contexts, informed consent can be more of a formality than really a genuine choice. Now, the second principle I would like to question, and this is also very new to me because I always was very adamant about anonymity and confidentiality in the research process. However, I came to believe that these two concepts don't always serve the best interest of participants, and probably it should be up to the participants to decide if they want to be anonymous or if they want to be named. I have two examples that could prove this. A friend of a friend was a researcher who conducted research in a hospital for children with life-threatening conditions, and the parents had to give consent for them to take part in the research. Of course, the children's anonymity was assured, but the children wanted to be named in the research report. And you can see why. They want, like all of us, to leave something of themselves in the world before leaving it. So was it right for the researchers to keep the kids' names anonymous? Yeah, this kind of presents and puts you in a gray area. Another example comes from the US, where a researcher was conducting research with Sudanese refugees. I know that many of you also work with refugees. And the institutional review board of the university required that she gave participants pseudonyms in a way to cover up their real identity. This is, as I said, very normal in the global north. But when she explained this to the participants, a lot of them refused to be part of the research, and the community leader also explained that he had a lot of stuff to tell, but he also wanted to be named. And then the researcher went on to investigate why people in this community were against anonymity, and she found out that actually forced name changing was a repressive practice from the Sudanese regime. So the ethical review board of the university, of course, couldn't possibly know about this. And this brings me to the last point, that many times our laws, ethical guidelines, and standards are set by organizations that take a very paternalistic approach and usually make decisions on behalf of participants. They usually also have they're well-meaning and they are well-intentioned, but probably a better way to do this would be to let participants make their own choices. And this brings me to talk a little bit about the indigenous paradigm, which is instead much more relational. The general principle here is that research is meant to improve the world. And in practice, this implies that there is, for example, relational accountability. This means that the people researching, usually researchers, are accountable to everyone and everything who is in relationship with them. This means the participants, but because indigenous people have a very broad view of relationships, this would also mean their families, the land animals. Communality of knowledge recognizes that everyone has useful knowledge to bring to research, and it doesn't matter how many years you have studied or what literacy levels you have. Reciprocity means that there is a reciprocal relationship between researcher and participants, and researcher shouldn't exploit participants just to extract knowledge from them. And finally, benefit sharing. I would say this is probably one of the most different from the Euro-Western paradigm of research, is that the participants and their community should directly benefit from the research too. Now, my point here is that we can learn some valuable lessons from indigenous principles of ethical research. And so in the next slides, I want to present you 4 transformative research frameworks that I believe overcome some of the deficits of Euro-Western principle of ethical research. So for now, what I'm going to show you are not methods, these are frameworks. So these are basically very general approaches to working with participants in research. If we think of microfinance institutions and the input, output, outcome, impact model, if you want to collect data on the outcomes and the impact of your services, this will probably mean that you're collecting data from your clients most of the times. So I generally want you to make an effort here and imagine your clients and their communities when we talk about participants for the rest of the webinar. The first transformative research framework I have here is participatory research. In general, it means involving participants, for example, your borrowers or clients, in producing the evaluation research. It also means that the participants are benefiting directly from your research, and also they feel empowered in producing the evaluation outcomes. Now, participation is a very broad word. So I also have put participation ladder kind of to understand what does it mean for a person to participate into research. At the bottom, we have
Julia, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Somebody muted me. Maybe they don't like the webinar. I hope not. So I was saying, I don't know how long I've been talking on mute. I hope not for long. But what was I talking about was there are different degrees of participation and different ways your borrowers or clients can participate in evaluation research. There is also non-participation, which usually means that, for example, either the participants are not asked to contribute to research, or we pretend that they're contributing when actually they're given no decision power. So this would be what's known as tokenism. If we move up the ladder, we have assigned but informed, which is most of the times what I would say was happening, you would inform your participants about the goals and mission of your research, and you assign them to participate, but you take the decisions about what they're supposed to do. Consulted and informed means that they're not only informed, but they're also consulted in decisions when it comes to research. So for example, they could be asked how they think it would be the best way to collect data or where. Partnership, it's really like a co-production of research where both parties, so the researchers and the researched, share equal decision-making power. And then, let's say the top is when participants are the ones who start and direct the research. To be honest, I don't see the last ladder as something feasible as of now, as most of you in your organization are the ones probably initiating evaluation based on research if you're interested in evaluating your services. So, so this was more kind of a general way of thinking about at what stage and how do you want to involve your participants. And we will see also what are the advantages of having the participants taking at least part of the decisions regarding the research process. Another approach that I named transformative research framework is what is known as activist research. So you see that distinguishing between different types of transformative research frameworks, first of all, is very artificial, and also doesn't mean that they cannot be used together. So for example, a person could combine a participatory approach with activist research. This type of research states that research that produces knowledge about oppression will not change the lived reality of the oppressed. And it is why it combines knowledge production with transformative action, usually through advocacy or policy advisory through policy briefs. So I also put you an example of this work, which is carried out by the European Roma Rights Center. Maybe you know them. They conduct research to inform and influence political bodies, and for example, the United Nations. So this is just an example. There are many more organizations to do this. And usually the outcomes of evaluation research in those cases are policy briefs that are then shared with political bodies. I will have one more example coming up later on in the webinar. Another type of transformative research framework is asset-based research. I think this is particularly interesting in your field. So the basic idea here is that asset-based research views a focus solely on problems, deficiencies, and gaps as too narrow and too reductive. Maybe you've heard from similar ideas in positive psychologies, which shifted the focus from studying pathology, weakness, and damage to exploring happiness, resilience, or well-being. So let's say here, the fundamental idea is that we emphasize assets, so strengths, rather than deficits. I also think that if you use such an approach, you can also enable a shift from fixing individuals that, for example, might be known as, not known, but individuals that might appear, for example, less career competent, to improving systems on how they can be supported. Now, I have explained this in another setting, and so I'm going to predict here a thought that you might have, which is if you are running a microfinance program, then of course the reason for doing this is that there is a problem. Otherwise, probably you wouldn't need to run it in the first place. So the problem could be most likely poverty. And that's why for this framework, I actually brought an example from the microfinance sector, because I want to show how it could definitely help to understand the impact of your program, even if you start by looking at assets rather than problems. So I also must say this is a fake example, but I hope it does the job. So for the sake of the illustration, let's say you're a microfinance institution in rural Bulgaria, and you're disbursing microloans to reduce poverty in the area, especially among farmers. And you decide that you want to assess if indeed your microfinance program and the loans especially are having a positive social impact. So if you approach this in a traditional way, then probably you will use two main indicators to evaluate your program. You might want to look at income. So for example, if the income of your clients has increased, and you might also want to track loan repayment rates. So the evaluators, and either you or if you hire some researchers to do the job, would collect data from your clients to assess these two indicators. And maybe through research, you will find out that the client's income has increased during the evaluation period, and you also see that loan repayment rates fluctuated, and mostly they decreased during low season, and loan repayment rates were higher during the harvesting season. So it's all good here, and it all makes sense. And you might also be very happy with your evaluation because it did provide evidence that your organization is having a positive social impact or at least outcome in the area. However, I want to show you how you could improve this traditional framework with an asset-based approach. So this would mean that besides focusing on income, which was indeed the problem, and the loan repayment rates, which could be the problem, you also want to focus on the broader assets of your clients. So you're basically assuming that your clients do have some strengths on their own, even before you came to offer to them microloans. So let's say that you consider human and social capital as the assets that your clients may or not have. So in this case, the evaluators will collect data on income, loan repayment rates, but also on human and social capital. So for the sake of the example, let's say that for human capital, we check their local knowledge of the land. And for social capital, the community ties they have in the communities where they live. Then you would analyze the data, and maybe the research would also lead you to think that the client's income has increased during the evaluation period. Again, well done. And then when it comes to the loan repayment rates, you see they have fluctuated, just like in the traditional research framework. But because you were also measuring their assets, you will see that fluctuations didn't happen for clients that have stronger human and social capital. So what happens here? You definitely have more information, and also now you would have information of how the system, the local system, could be improved to support your clients even better than you were doing before. So this approach assumes that although there is a problem of poverty in rural Bulgaria, in this example, people have nevertheless assets, maybe in this case not income, but social and human capital that can be used and strengthened through the system. I'm gonna go on to another transformative research framework I want to talk to you about, which might be relevant for some of you. Is it okay if I take questions, Jörg and Jana?
Questions
so-
always have priority.
I'm
So,
gonna take the
please-
question because I always find it nice when we can address the question in the moment in which they are posed, because then we forget about them. So I'm just gonna go back to the slide, and the question is about how to elaborate on human and social capital and what can be measured. I think this is a good question, and the problem of what to measure is one that I have addressed also in other webinars where I specifically talked about indicators. I must say this is not what I have planned for this webinar, but usually when you're building or when you're looking at the impact model, like what I showed before, or if you go even a step further and develop a theory of change, which is, let's say, an improved impact model, you will have to set indicators for what you want to measure. If you decide that you're interested in measuring social and human capital, let's take one of them, social capital, then there are repositories online where you can find how other organizations measure social capital. So you usually get very good hints as the system is relatively, the impact measurement system is relatively well developed nowadays. One of the biggest databases for indicators is called IRIS Plus. Maybe Jörg or Joanna, you can write it in the chat, where it really helps you find a way to measure whatever you're interested in. And if you're not sure what you are interested in, it even helps you think about what you could measure to evaluate your program. So, of course, you will find different ways in which social capital could be measured, but there you find their suggestions, which are usually very valid, or you might have to come up with your own way to measure. And again, like, I'm just not sure how in depth I should go because this is a whole other chapter of impact evaluations, indicators that can be proxies. So you might not be able to measure social capital, but something that we can use as a proxy that could inform. For example, you might not be able to measure income levels, but you can measure spending levels because usually people with more income tend to spend more. So this would be a way to go around a measurement problem. But as I said, I'm not sure how in depth I should go. I saw that Jörg shared the IRIS Plus platform, and I think there you can find a lot of information on how to measure. If you come to identify an indicator, then the IRIS platform would also tell you exactly how it can be measured. It would give you examples, and it would also give you literature that can inform your decisions. Jörg?
Yeah. Maybe just to add on what you said, this is where other people's research really comes in handy. We can safely assume that all social problems you want to address have already been researched one way or another. Probably not in your area where you operate, probably with a slightly different target group, but you will find almost too much research, for example, on the relevance of social and human capital. And so you can build on that, I would say. So even if you are not really sure how to measure that and how to engage with that, you can build on what other researchers have done. So taking into consideration the different frameworks. So that can be a bit tricky.
But I agree with what Jörg said. You usually start with what is already there because you don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? So you check what other people have done, and if it can be applied in your case, I always recommend to do that because it's the quickest option, and probably it is already it's there because it worked. Sometimes you cannot find exactly what you need, and so you might have to come up with a customized way of measure the indicator that you're interested in. And now that I see that I gave us example of social capital, community ties, actually one of the methods could probably, that I'm going to present later, probably could be used to do that. But again, I think what Jörg said is the better answer. First, look on what's already there. And if I have another webinar, I still don't know about specific to impact measurement, then I usually also explain this in much more detail than I will do today. So if it's okay, I'm gonna move on. And Jörg and Joanna, I don't always see the chat, so if you see something, let me know.
If I see a comment or a question and while you're talking, I would just raise my hand.
That's great. Now, the last transformative research framework I was gonna discuss is trauma-informed research. Might or not be relevant. And although a trauma-informed approach involves assuming that participants could have experienced trauma, you usually don't have to screen for trauma, so you don't need to be a psychologist or similar. So actually what the framework does is trying to minimize the likelihood of distress and re-traumatization for participants. And it also means you have a plan in case this happens and in case participants do become distressed during the involvement in your research. Now, this might be relevant for those of you who work with highly vulnerable communities, but it's never bad to have a plan because you don't know what happened in the lives of people. If this sounds far from what you're doing, I'm actually gonna give you an example, which should be close enough. This is an example of a project which I've been involved in, where we plan to empower adult survivors of domestic violence through entrepreneurship training. So this is without doubt a highly vulnerable community and that definitely experience trauma, and that's why trauma-informed research principles helped us a lot, not only to have a plan in case participants got distressed, but also considering really the practical implications of trauma during the data collection process. So this example does not really deal with the collection of data on outputs and income, but rather we actually had set up focus groups to evaluate the entrepreneurship needs of the participants that were in the program. So it was sort of a needs assessment. Now, what did it mean in practice? What did we do different? First of all, and you will see that many of the stuff I'm gonna mention now is something I have already mentioned relative to other frameworks. For example, when we talked about participatory research, in this case, we gave participants control over as many aspects of the data collection process as possible, including asking them where the data collection would happen, because they had to be a psychologically and physically safe environment for them. So they were free to choose the place. The types of questions and the ways of asking. We try to avoid any direct questions on traumatic experiences unless they were necessary. And also we avoided asking questions that started with why, because usually they sound very judgmental. We were very careful in designing the order of the questions. So we started with least sensitive questions and then gradually moved to more sensitive topics. And in general, and the general principle here is that the needs of the participants always came first and not the requirements of the research, which also means, of course, they would also always free to jump out of the research process at any time without compromising their participation in the program. So with this, I conclude the fundamentals, and I think we are ready to move to, let's say, a more practice. And the second part of the webinar is indeed more practice, because we're really talking methods for data collection. Before we do that, I do still have a way to open this part of the webinar, and I want to spend a quick moment talking about what data is. So what is data? I think many of us, when you hear the word data, you immediately think of some facts and numbers. And even if you look at the definitions in the dictionary, that's what they tell you. However, pretty much anything can be data. But this does not mean that anything can be data for your evaluation research. And this brings me to argue that all forms of data are credible and valid as long as they're used in purposeful ways. So I just suggest we change the question from what is data to what is good data. And good data and data is good as long as it serves the purpose. So if your purpose is to evaluate your services, so good data would allow you to do so. For how good data is, it would always need the essential human ingredient, so the data literate. That's what we're trying to do here today, since you will be the one or your team that needs to use the data in meaningful ways. This also means that while questionnaires, interviews, and focus group are very common ways to collect data for impact management, they are not necessarily the only way or the best one. So what I want to do is to look with you at different types of data and what are the strategies and methods we can use to collect them. In general, very quickly, research methods are typically divided into two big groups. The first are those used to collect quantitative data, which is numbers and measurements, and then those that are used to collect qualitative data, which is everything but numbers and measurements. So this makes up a very big group, which could be, usually it is text, like stories, narrative, transcripts, but it could be many other things, sculptures, photos, artifacts. Of course, in the first case, then you will need some statistical skills to analyze it. In the second case, the analysis can happen in very different ways, and in general, it would be statistics wouldn't be needed. A brief history here for full disclosure. Quantitative methods have originated from the hard sciences, such as physics and chemistry, and therefore usually they are linked to concepts like being objective or being a man, masculinity, and instead qualitative data usually it's more associated to subjectivity, femininity, interpretivism. So for a long time, these associations have led some people to critique or even think the qualitative methods are somehow either not valid or inferior. However, if you really think of it, such critiques are closely tied to the question of who had traditionally power in science, which were and partly still are white men. So without going into the history, I just want to share this image that you see on the slide. This is from a study that looks at sexist cyberbullying on social media, where male quantitative researchers were bullying female qualitative researchers exactly because of the research methods. So what I want to emphasize here is that there's no need for bullying, and also that both quantitative and qualitative methods are, and the data that they produce are valid approaches to research. And the choice really depends entirely on the goals of your evaluation research. So not always numbers are what you need. And usually how can you decide what you need? Very generally, you would use qualitative methods if you need in-depth insights from a relatively small number of people. And quantitative methods instead tend to be better if you want to collect data from a large number of people. The thing is that you will not get very in-depth insights because you will mostly collect data through numbers and measurements. So this is really a question of not just what your resources are, but what are the goal of your evaluation. Now, of course, you may want to address the pros and cons of both quantitative and qualitative methods by combining them. And this is called mixed methods designs, which can take various forms. You can see on the slide, the sequential designs basically means, first example, you first collect qualitative data. For example, you do interviews, and then quantitative data, you might broaden your sample and send a questionnaire, or you might send a questionnaire to the same people you have interviewed. The second is kind of the opposite case, but in both cases, the design is sequential because data collection happens at two different moments in time. Concurrent designs, I would say they're even more difficult to implement because data collection for both qualitative and quantitative data happens at the same time. Now, I think if you don't have done this if you haven't done this for a long time, is I would discourage somebody to undertake a mixed method project, because it can be very complicated. But if it might work, it's just that you need definitely a solid understanding of both quantitative and qualitative data to do so. Yes, Jörg.
I want to ask a provocative question.
Yeah, I
So-
knew I would be provocative when I saw that you raised your hand.
If you want to answer that later or not at all, that's perfectly okay.
Mhm.
So when I looked into the different research methods, what I found interesting is that one of the arguments presented for quantitative research is the rigor in the method. So you have statistical methods, and that's how the research justifies its yeah, I don't want to say value, but the generalizability, for example, and qualitative data, or those who prefer qualitative research, employ more different philosophical positions about what it is truth and what can you actually measure. So, for example, through questionnaires. And I'm not sure that has been finally solved. But I would say, like, for the purpose of this webinar, that it is more important to think about, can you really measure what you want to measure, or what you want to achieve, like the impact? Do you need proxies, and where do you get that from? So you gave the example earlier of spending, for example, and that's from the spending, using spending as a proxy for income. You probably can get more insight. So how important, in your opinion, is interpretation of the data?
You asked many more questions than one. You are aware of it.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
No, I just can say that we will talk a lot of methods now, because my plan was really to bomb you with many methods and then try to see what you think of them. So I think partly I will answer your questions along the webinar. The question of what rigorous science is, I think that's also why I gave this very small intro into the history of science, because it really depends on who makes the rules. And that's why most of the qualitative methods have been, let's say, not considered as good science, just because they were done and pursued by people who couldn't even go to the university until 60 years ago. So I think that's also why I mentioned that you don't necessarily need to measure, and or at least not in the quantitative sense of the term. And with this, I move on, and I'm happy to pick up again on these discussions later on if we have time in the Q&A. Would that be okay?
Perfect.
Yeah. So as I said, today I'm going to introduce you to a whole menu of quantitative and qualitative methods. We will start with traditional approaches to more creative ones, and you will also see a bigger focus on qualitative methods, just because there is simply more of them. Since they are used to collect everything that is not numbers, then we have a greater variety. For each method I present, I also will share examples, and I must disclose that not many of these examples come from the microfinance sector. I couldn't find many relevant cases in this field, and I think there are two reasons. First, that not so many microfinance institutions currently collect and analyze data for impact management. Some are starting to do so, but the ones that are starting usually really use still traditional methods. So that's why I couldn't give you many examples of creative illustrations in the microfinance sector, but maybe next time we talk, or maybe you know some I couldn't find. As I said, I consider the most traditional stuff, and you probably, even if you're not a researcher, have at least heard of questionnaires. You want to use a questionnaire if you're interested in understanding what happened and what didn't happen. And quantitative data is used to explore the relationship between independent variables, so the causes, and the dependent variables, which are the effects of those causes. And then you have control variables that you need to pay attention to, because they might influence the relationship, but you don't really have an influence on them. So basically, in quantitative research, you might want to use questionnaires to collect data on those variables. This sounds relatively abstract, that's why I would just go immediately to an example. Let's say you're evaluating your microfinance program and you want to see, or you think that the degree of participation, which in this case is your independent variable, has influenced the income of your client. So it has had the effect of a change in income. So once you have established that these are the two things you want to measure, like the two variables, then you have to decide a little bit, like we talked before, how do you want to go about measuring them? Again, here the discussion could be very long, but for the sake of the example, let's say that you want to measure the degree of participation by looking, for example, if the client had also participated in the training part of your program, how big was the loan disbursed to the client, and maybe the number of interactions with the loan officer. And then the change in income will be your dependent variable, because you think it depends from the degree of participation, and you might want to measure it by asking participants if their income has changed, for instance. However, there are other variables like age or gender, the educational level, or the income that people had before joining your program that might influence the relationship. The thing is that you cannot influence them. And that's why the best thing you can do in these cases is simply to measure them, so that then you can see if the relationship changes according to different demographic groups. Now, if you want to set up a questionnaire, then, as I said, you will have to identify what are the variables you want to measure, and then you will have to develop questions that attempt to measure these variables. To collect numerical information, you will have to ask close-ended questions. Usually using scale questions is better than dichotomous or multiple choice questions. Dichotomous are questions where you only have two options when replying. And can anybody maybe intervene, or I don't know, Jörg, why do you think dichotomous questions are a bad choice in this case, in the example on the slide?
You want me to answer that?
I don't know. Does anybody want to answer?
Well, first of all, the question is bad.
Yeah, but why?
Because it has a bias. It's like, has your income increased?
Yes, so it's bad because we're assuming it has increased.
You don't try to understand what happened, like the context in which it happens. Let's say you had a heat wave or a flood or any other event, and then all of a sudden your harvest is destroyed or lower, and it's like, oh, it hasn't increased. So this also can have a bad impact on the participant or the beneficiary of your services. So yeah, there are many things wrong with this question.
I'm going to add, besides the context, which is usually very difficult to capture in a questionnaire, the question is bad because it gives me two options where I can either say that the income has increased or not. But if I say it hasn't, I don't even know if it stayed the same or if it has decreased. Plus, there are no nuances. So that's what I'm trying to say. Usually scale questions captures nuances much better, and you could also distinguish between a bigger and smaller increase or no change whatsoever. Now, what else? As Jörg mentioned, you don't want to lead your respondents to what you want to hear. For example, that their income has increased. That's why you have to formulate them in a neutral way. And also you have to be careful that the questionnaire is written in a language they understand. You might need translators or locals to help you with that. You should be mindful of literacy levels. And also if you are distributing the questionnaire through the internet, then you also have to be careful that people do have access to the internet. As we mentioned at the beginning, usually the respondent's identity is kept anonymous, but I do think it would be also better just to let the participants choose if they want to be indeed anonymous. Now, again, staying on the traditional side of things, if quantitative research really measures, then qualitative research tries to instead explore, understands, and interpret. That's why it captures also the context much better. And this is why you usually collect qualitative data to answer questions such as why and how something happened or didn't happen. The most common methods for collecting qualitative data are interviews and focus groups. And the main difference is that interviews typically are one-to-one, while in focus groups, the questions are discussed together in a group. And in this context,
Did we lose Julia?
Yeah, it looks like we lost Julia. So let's wait a second until she comes back.
It looks that it's frozen, some sort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably her connection is not okay. We'll wait for a second.
So let's give Julia a second to reconnect. Go.
Hi.
Hi, Julia. Good to have you back.
sometimes I scare you're just trying actively to push me out.
It
I
wasn't
hope
me.
that's not the case.
No. No one has that power.
Okay. I'm back. I don't know until where you heard, but I hope you can see my screen again. And
Yes. we can.
what I was saying that deciding on the methods also might depend on your resources, because as you can see, it will take you much longer to run an interview than send out a questionnaire. What else? I think these are some best practices when interviewing or running a focus group. Just like for quantitative data collection, you will try to avoid leading questions where you are basically getting the answer that you were expecting or wanting. You have to decide on your questions in advance, which means you're going prepared to the interview, so you're not making up stuff on the spots. Again, you will be mindful of language, the literacy levels, and the access to the internet if you're running your interviews or focus group online. Language is specifically important as you will need to master the language of the interviewee if you want them to talk freely. And as I said, usually in the Euro-Western paradigm, then you would keep the identity confidential, which basically means you might be aware of the name of the person you're talking to, but you will keep it confidential, so you will not disclose it, for example, to somebody else or in an impact report. Yes, Joanna.
I was wondering if here it's also considering that, especially for organizations that don't necessarily have experience in impact assessment or working with these tools, to have like a group of people to discuss the questions and to try to eliminate any bias that probably one person is not aware of. For example, when
Depends. So you might want to do this with more than a person, but it depends also because it might be even more threatening for the person being interviewed if there are more than one people there. In a group, it's also more cost efficient. You have a group of people that can discuss questions. It's usually not ideal if you have very sensitive topics that people might not be comfortable to discuss in a group. Maybe income levels would be one of them. I guess depends on the culture.
I was thinking more when you create the
When you create the
service.
instrument, yes, that's a very good point. It's always good that you're not doing this alone. Even if you're running the interview alone, you might want to check before you start using it, because of course, if there are any biases, and we will talk a bit about biases later, you might not be able to spot them by yourself. So yeah, that's a very good point. So my next slides are about more creative methods. And as I said, I couldn't actually find examples from the microfinance sector of microfinance institutions collecting data with creative methods. So here I'm asking you a very big favor, which is really like try to make an extra effort of imagining these methods for yourself. And the examples I'm going to talk about in your sector. Like, do you think the following methods are anything you could apply? Would they help you in collecting data on your microfinance program? So these are questions I cannot answer because I'm not a microfinance institution, but I hope that you can think about as I present the methods, and you're also very free to comment in the chat. Maybe one more thing before I go on creative methods. Even creative methods usually are partly based on traditional methods. So some of what I'm going to talk about will sound very familiar to what we already discussed. The first example I have is collecting data with timeline enhanced interviews. As you can recognize, it's based on interviews. The examples I brought is from researchers who used it to research overweight and weight loss. And they used the method with 9 participants who were women and who had been obese and overweight. So each participant worked with researchers to construct a timeline during the interview where they were asked to focus on the part of their life when weight was a problem, but also kind of really drawing significant life events and experiences that happened during that period. So this hopefully gives you richer data that you would have with an interview alone, and might also really, if you're asking from past events, would help participants recollect stuff that had happened in their lives and might have not in the head anymore so well. Another example is actually from me. It's collecting data with photo-enhanced interviews. This is from an evaluation project where we used photo-enhanced interviews to evaluate the training, coaching, and mentoring services of a microfinance organization that was offering services to young people who were not in employment, education, or training. So because this method was extremely time consuming, we only worked with 9 people who were asked to select between 8 and 10 images that represented their thoughts and feelings about the services received. And then the participants had to bring the images to the interviews. The interviews were really in depth. Usually they were about 1.5 hours each. And they were structured along 7 exercises that we did using the pictures. So I'm not going to go into detail, But I just have here a collage of not even all of it, but some of the pictures that the participants shared with us during the interviews. I hope you can see the advantages. We got much richer data that we would have done with a traditional interview. Since these were young people and some of them would get bored of a traditional interview, I thought this method also introduced a gaming component, and that was more fun, and also gave them some degree of control because they brought the pictures to the interview process, so they control part of the data collection process, which is not how it usually happens. And also the images were extremely good when they wanted to express emotions that were not able to express verbally. So this gave us really rich insights, and as I said, it was used during the evaluation of the services.
I have a question.
We have a question.
Yes, I'm reading it. Do you think this method would bring more information in the comparable time than a client interview? Than a traditional interviews? Yes, we had, because we had both the interview and the images. So there was more information. It also led to much longer interviews because I cannot imagine having an interview with some participants. We sat there for almost 3 hours. I cannot imagine doing this if I only had a sheet of paper with even 10 questions. We would definitely get through all the 10 questions before then. Now, I didn't write this on the slide, but now that I think of it, I think it was also more sensitive to neurodiverse individuals that might struggle to express themselves in an elaborate way verbally. I'm not sure, like, yes, the interviews were extremely long, and you might, in the end, get more interviews if you did something without the images, for sure. But that's why maybe this goes back to what was the goal of our research. We wanted a lot of very in-depth information. That's why this method worked very well for us. But if your goal is not that, then this would be a very bad way to gather data because it's extremely time consuming. So you can imagine that we had to do this with almost 10 people. So this is almost 40 hours of interviews. But for the purpose of our research, and the research was especially looking at the emotional journey of people getting the services, yes, I think it was better than having a traditional interview, for sure. Yes, Jörg, or not?
I just would like to agree with you. So if you use, like during interviews, artifacts, objects that are important for the beneficiaries or the persons you're interviewing, or a selection of postcards, it's so much easier to build a relationship and to reduce the power differential. So the researcher, like, I know it all and I'm just here to see and to evaluate. And then the person, oh, I wish I would be where you are. So it's much easier to talk like on, like eye to eye, or see eye to eye, and have an open conversation about something. And these objects, artifacts, can also serve as a trigger. So that's also the limitation, I would say. Sometimes it's limited because what you have with the objects or what's depicted in the pictures, but it's super helpful, especially when you talk, for example, with persons who are much younger than you are, or in a different economic bracket. Like if you talk to low-income communities or really disadvantaged, disenfranchised groups,
I also
or
maybe must give away because that's something I didn't talk about. But in this case, we pay the participants because the time was just we asked for 2 hours of their time, plus they had to research the pictures before bringing them. So in that case, they also got a financial contribution for their time, which we hoped would not just encourage them, but also express our gratitude for doing this work with us. So I haven't done this all the time, but in that case, we chose it was needed. Should I go on, Jörg, or you want to add anything?
please do. No.
The next might not be so creative, but still something that you might have not thought about is collecting data with WhatsApp, which is extremely cheap and is good reach. This is an example of a project where the researchers were examining LGBTIQ+ individuals in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, so in Africa, and they wanted to see the experience they had and the kind of terminology and labels they get from other people is usually discriminatory labels and harmful language. And so they had 19 participants, which were asked questions via WhatsApp, and then they could either reply through messages or send voice recordings. And the immediate advantage was that they could, of course, do the research during the COVID-19 lockdowns, where otherwise it wouldn't be possible to meet. There was also no pressure to reply in real time. And I think that's maybe the biggest advantage. And then I'm gonna read and take the questions, is that considering that the emphasis really was on biased and harmful language, maybe having it on WhatsApp was less invasive than being directly asked in a interview and having to repeat this harmful language verbally. Yes.
We have another question from Alfonso. Is there any data protection concerns using WhatsApp or similar?
That's a very good question, Alfonso, and I'm sorry I'm not very much prepared, but in general, every time you're using any platform, WhatsApp is one of them, then ideally you will have to become familiar with the data protection and the data privacy rules that the platform offers, which unfortunately, since these are usually big tech US companies, are not many. So I don't have a direct answer, but there might be, of course, concerns. For example, I know for myself that I work for universities that are against Zoom, or like we don't use Zoom because of the same reason. So you will have to be careful with that. That's true. I think the paper also had an ethical section that might address what you're asking. The slides at the end have all the references and also all the studies I'm referring to. So maybe one answer or a more direct answer would be go check the paper and see if you find how they handle that. This might be maybe better than having to read the WhatsApp data privacy rules. I'm moving on to something else. Here we have a different type of focus group. The NEAT and NATTER focus groups were used from 2 researchers in the UK who were actually exploring undervalued forms of domestic work. And so they set up 3 NEAT and NATTER focus groups in the UK. In each focus group, they had 15 participants that were asked to come. So it was a physical focus group, an in-presence focus group, and they had to meet and talk. The advantages, they say that the advantages was that the atmosphere was much better and more relaxed. It also facilitated openness because there was time to talk and the production of rich qualitative data. Another thing they mentioned is that because actually the researchers didn't know how to knit very well or didn't know how to knit at all, and this was also a way to empower the participants because they were the experts in the setting. Okay, sorry, I was checking the chat, but it wasn't a question. So this is definitely something creative, but it worked very well for the purpose of the research, which was also domestic women's work. So the Knit and Natter focus group really was closely related to the topic of the focus group itself. I'm not going to read the questions unless you raise your hand, and I know that they're relevant. This is a method that came to mind when somebody asked about how to measure social capital and especially the community ties of a person. Here, the researcher was not looking necessarily at social capital, but still it came to mind because the researcher end product was a map of connections. And the research itself was looking at the relationship of children with their carers. And as in many other studies that work with children, usually many times they're asked to draw because their verbal skills are still not very advanced. And in that case, every child was given a sheet of paper with several concentric circles, and then they had to draw their self-portrait in the middle, and then also draw the pictures of the people who took care of them, from the most important or the closest people to the ones that were least important. Again, this was done together in an interview. Nevertheless, by the end on the interview, the researcher had a map of connections and also a clear snapshot of the care received, which also really helped the data analysis process. So this might be helpful if you want to also map the connections of adults, especially if they're relevant to the type of data you're looking for. I gonna move to the second last creative method, which is collecting data with photo diaries. They were used to conduct an assessment on the needs of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in the UK. And the 22 participants were asked to produce a photo diary. They were also helped by the researchers in doing so. So what the participants had to do was to include photographs with very short descriptions for the photographs they took, and then give back the diary to the researchers. It was considered less invasive than asking direct questions, but what was extremely important in that context that it helped people that had very low levels of English communicate, again, with the idea that everybody has knowledge and can contribute to research, doesn't matter how well you speak a language or which school you went to. So this was a kind of a way to increase participation. And finally, collecting data with props combines a bit of what we have seen before. This was an EU-funded project which explored how to better integrate older people into the everyday life of their communities to avoid social exclusion. And at the beginning, so the researchers used very different ways to collect the data. And at the beginning, because the participants were in very different places and countries, they thought that they would just do online interviews on Zoom. But then they realized that because most participants were very old, over 85, they didn't know how to use tools like Zoom. So then they thought, okay, we will just do telephone interviews. But this also didn't work out because many of the participants were old and had hearing issues, so they couldn't hear very well over the phone, and they also were too tired to sit in a long interviews. And that's why in the end, this kind of, from a problem, it became a creative solution because the researchers decided to design packages with tasks for participants, and the packages included postcards with questions to answers. There included maps and also disposable cameras that participants could use to take photos. So researchers create what they're called cultural probes, and the participants were done with their tasks, they could send them back. This was also good because it means that the participants, since they were old and fatigued, didn't have to do the data collection all at once, but they could take their time and do it every time they felt like and they were feeling well. So this kind of ends my part on data collection methods. I know I talked about a lot of different methods, but it was really to show you that there are different ways and different data you might want to consider when in the research process. So slowly but steady, we are getting towards the end. I realize now I think I'm over time, but I am guessing, Jörg, that I just continue talking until you stop me.
We still have 30 minutes, so we are
Okay,
very
that's great.
relaxed.
Okay, so what I want to talk now, it's really how to make the most of your research efforts, and more specifically, I'm interested in sharing how bias can be addressed when dealing with data. We also discuss the concept of additionality, and then conclude by discussing how research and data literacy can also be gained if you collaborate with research institutions. Now, what is bias? We briefly mentioned it before when talking about questionnaires, I think, and also when Joanna made the intervention about interviews. But just for the sake of clarity, bias is any deviation from the truth in data collection, data analysis, interpretation, and reporting, which can lead to false conclusions. So bias can happen either intentionally or unintentionally. And I'm sorry for my gruesome example, but I often compare it to the difference between involuntary manslaughter or murder, because in both cases it's bad since a person ends up dead. However, murder is bad because it's immoral, just like intentional bias, and involuntary manslaughter is caused by negligence, which is also irresponsible, just like unintentional bias. So I hope you can still accept the example as it is. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the ways in which bias can happen, but I brought a few examples that I thought might be relevant for the field. So the first, which partly already we touched upon, was confirmation bias. So this is a type of researcher bias that comes from the person collecting the data, and it happens when what we expect influences how we design the data collection and what kind of data we collect. So this is an example of a microfinance institution which wants to evaluate a social their microfinance program, and decides to interview participants who have benefited from the program. So one of the questions they plan to ask is, since joining the program, how much has your income increased and how much can you save now? I think as I said, we partly touched upon this before. This question is very bad and is very much biased because it really is trying to confirm what the researcher expects, which is that the person's income has increased because of the program. So how can we make it better? How can we make this question less biased? We can make it much more neutral. So normally an interview, a good primary question should be rather broad and also should not provide assumptions about the income. Instead, the question I had was really much expecting the income to be increased without considering any other options. It was also kind of judgmental because it also assumes that the person now can set money aside. And it was also bad because it was combining two things into one, a question about income change and a question about savings. So what you can do is to just reformulate it in much broader terms. For example, can you describe if and how your income has changed since joining the program? So this could be a primary question. And then you could follow up based on the answers then the participant is giving you. I have another example of bias. This time it's a type of response bias where people tend to answer questions or behave in ways that they think would be seen as good by others. So this doesn't really come necessarily from the researcher, but from the participants. In this vignette, again, a microfinance institution is conducting interviews with borrowers, and to better understand their satisfaction with the services, they ask questions about their satisfaction. They also ensure that all responses will be confidential, but they also say that the interviews are not anonymous. Usually interviews are not. They also explain that besides not being anonymous, the loan officers are the ones who are conducting the interviews. And during the interviews, clients reported they are very satisfied with the program. Now, I hope you can see how this is a situation that is very much prone to social desirability bias. How can we solve this? Well, here the problem is that we should involve a more neutral party in the data collection process because the loan officers are probably the least neutral party in that context. And so either we want to involve somebody who doesn't know the participants, even if the persons work for the microfinance institution, or you want to really involve a completely independent organization. So this would give you probably more fruitful data. And now I have one last example, which, however, is not coming from the data collection phase, but from the reporting phase. We didn't talk about impact reporting because it wasn't part of the webinar, but of course, one of the things you will do with your impact data is to report it. And in this example, we have a microfinance institution in Spain who is preparing to publish an impact report on its microfinance program. And as part of the report, they are designing a graph which presents the changes in client income levels after the clients have joined the program. So you can see that the x-axis show a timeline, so 3 periods of time before the participants join the program, 6 months after and 1 year after. And the y-axis shows their income levels, so the average monthly income levels. Any problems with this graph?
Many.
Anything you spot?
Well, I mean, you could make it more dramatic if you would use less space for the y-axis. So then the graph would be even steeper, like, and of course the y-axis is like the scaling here is.
Yeah. So the problem is the y-axis bias is called, and you wouldn't believe how common it is because I had a look at impact reports from the microfinance field, and I ended up doing my own graph because I didn't want to talk bad about anybody. So the problem here is that if you really look carefully, their average income has increased of 15 euros. 1 year after joining the program. So that's really probably not a significant amount in Spain. And that's why if you put it in context, that's how this line actually looks if you start from 0. And another type of reporting bias, which is also very common, I didn't put it here, is cherry picking. You just report the success stories in your impact report, which is again not leading to fruitful results. So these are some common biases in research and especially impact evaluation research. One of the last things I wanted to talk about was additionality, because I did get this question several times and I had the feeling I never had, I didn't have an answer, but I never had a practical answer. So I still wanted to address this before the end of the webinar. And I know that most of you probably know what the term additionality means. And for microfinance institutions, additionality often means being able to demonstrate how your services, for example, a microfinance program, generate unique social and economic value beyond conventional finance. So here the reasoning basically implies that knowing what would have happened if your program didn't exist. And if you think that's easier said than done, then that's, I think, the problem with additionality. So if we approach this traditionally, then we need to use the concepts of control and test groups, which originally come from medicine. And with this, we would need to demonstrate that the test group, so the people who have received your services, are better off than the control group, which are very similar people to them, but didn't receive your services. So doing this is actually extremely difficult in practice. There are very few organizations who have done it or are doing it. And one of them is JPAL, whose founders also won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019. So the prize was awarded in recognition of how their research method, which is randomized controlled trials, transform the field of social policy and economic development. So randomized controlled trials work very much like what we have just seen in the previous slide. You divide people into groups. And the difference is that people are assigned to one of the two groups randomly. Now, you can imagine the ethical concerns of doing such a thing. I mean, JPAL would go to a community in Africa and then provide mosquito nets, for example, to some members of the community, and randomly not giving mosquito nets to others, so that they would have these two groups. And this really makes it possible to estimate the causal impact of an intervention and what changes happen because of the program. As I said, there are ethical concerns about providing anything, an intervention, a service, from a group to a group and then not giving it to another just for the sake of evaluation. JPAL has its own ethics standards about this. I had a look and they were very interesting, but I also know that most people, besides the ethical implications, wouldn't have the resources to run randomized controlled trials. And we will talk about this in a moment. But or now. So many organizations wouldn't be able to implement randomized controlled trials because you need a lot of resources. And first of all, very, very skilled quantitative researchers to start with. And then you will still have to struggle with the ethics of the methods. Nevertheless, I brought it up because I think the website is really amazing and what they've done does deserve the Nobel Prize. I really encourage you to go and have a look at the website because they have a database with more than 1,000 evaluations, which were run with randomized controlled trials. And if you filter for microfinance evaluations, they're really short and they really get to the point very quickly. So I think it's very good data there and very concise information that could hopefully help with some of the questions we had during this webinar, but also in general how to approach evaluation or even the services you are offering. Now, just because we can't all implement randomized controlled trials, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about additionality. And that's why I brought it up in this webinar, because I really wanted to offer some practical solutions for those who cannot implement this method or don't want, or in context in which this method would be highly unethical. So if we say that microfinance institutions should be able to demonstrate how their services generate unique value, then we also have to find a way to do so. So what could be practical solutions? I think that one way to demonstrate that your microfinance program generates unique value is by considering if your clients have access to financial services, which I'm sure most of you do, but this could have implication also from the data collection point of view. For example, if you're interested in looking at the access that your clients have to financial services, you could simply add a question in a questionnaire, if that's how you're evaluating your services, where you ask them if they have tried to access traditional banking. And if they say no, then you know that they could have access, but they didn't use it. If they say yes, then you're sure that you're providing additional services. But even if they could access traditional banking, you could still prove that your services are better, for example, by comparing it to conventional banks. You could ask them to rate the financial services you offer compared to the ones offered by traditional banking. Or also, if you provide additional services that a traditional bank wouldn't. For example, many of your programs also have a training component, which is not necessarily something you would find in the traditional banking sector. So I think these are like the three valid ways to prove additionality without randomized controlled trials. And finally, and then I really come to an end, I realized that many of you might not have the time to invest in research, and that's why I really encourage you to consider collaborating with research institutions along your impact management journey. I think these collaborations, if they're set up well, they could be win-win solutions, because they're a very cost-effective option for you, since usually they are for free. And there are plenty of students and researchers who really don't have access to real data. And as someone who works in a couple of universities, you can't imagine how many bachelor and master students struggle to find real data to complete their thesis. So I always would suggest to contact local universities, because they're the most familiar with your specific context, and mostly people would also talk the language you need to complete data collection successfully. I also put you the name of an organization that really worked out best practices for this type of collaborations. And then I also added one example. I know it's not microfinance, but still. This is the German-based Roots of Impact, which is a manager of catalytic capital. They have a website, a part of their website dedicated to an open call for research collaborations on impact link finance. So you can contact them if you're interested. As a researcher, I think that's great. But they even provide a list of topics that they're interested in, and also the related timeline. So I think that's really a cheap way to do it, but I think it's very effective, because just dedicating a part of your website to an open call for evaluation research would probably cost you not much. And of course, you can always contact me if that's something you would be interested in. I am done. I had the feeling I talked a lot, so thanks a lot for listening to me for so long. This is my contact if you want to reach out for anything. And of course, you will get the slides from Joanna. As I mentioned, I put all the references and the studies I mentioned, so you can always find the original source. And otherwise, I'm also happy to get a couple of questions if there's anything else.
Thank you, Julia. If anyone would like to add a question, please take the opportunity.
Maybe I can start with a comment.
Yes.
Julia mentioned the collaboration. There's a very practical reason to collaborate. So if you want to do good impact assessments or impact reports, at some point you need to have a look at what other researchers in the field have already done. And there are literally hundreds of journals dedicated to small businesses, micro enterprises, and all related topics. And you don't have access to them. So, and each article costs you around about 30, 35 euros. So you probably want to have a look at around about 100, 150. Not everything is relevant. And now do the math and think how much money you need to invest just to have an overview of what others have done and to have really a good idea how you can add value to that. So there's really a financial argument in collaborating with research institutes or researchers like Julia, because through the universities, they have access to these to this form of research. And another aspect, which I think is really highly relevant, is the research ethics and the question about what is truth. And every master's student or PhD candidate will at some point have a situation where smoke is coming out of their ears, thinking about what's reality, what's the truth here. And it's a difficult question, and it's not easy to answer. There's no straight answer to that. And again, this is where I find collaborating with universities extremely helpful. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I have the feeling it's a very untapped resource because I see plenty of students asking me, where am I going to get the data? And I think there's so much data there if they only call us. So yeah, I think that's really untapped. So it's good to emphasize it. I have the feeling that's the first time I talk so much. I
mean, thankfully, you picked one of the most challenging topics for today. It's easier to talk about impact assessment frameworks.
It was easier somehow, I have the feeling. I know it's for the first time.
Or, identify indicators. It's indeed easier. And this is a really complex topic. And I'm really, really grateful for what you did and what you shared with us today.
That's good. I'm really happy that we got also questions. I always find it more interactive, and so you can also steer the conversation to go into the right places.
Yeah. So can I quickly ask, are there any other questions from the audience?
Doesn't look so, no?
That seems to be solid. I don't know yet.
It seems to be okay. That's it.
One of the comments you made, Julia, and I want to pick up on that, is impact assessment is really important. And at the end, we really want to support organizations. And we have put that into our work plan for the next 3 years. So, Julia, there's more work coming your way.
Yeah.
That is something I can already answer. But also for you here, the finding a good starting point is difficult, and please reach out if you want to do something, and we will always find a place to talk and see how we can collaborate on that and support you.
Yeah, that's good. No, today I think it was broader than my usual TLC, so that's why. But I think it was also needed. I rarely talk about ethics, but of course, it's also highly relevant, especially with work with vulnerable population and marginalized individuals. I mean, that's what microfinance is about, and I'm learning still.
For those who are interested, Julia has published an article which touched on an ethical conversation. I don't know the exact title, but the butterfly effect, where she starts with sharing a story about the fridge, where someone asked, well, if we have to set up a control group, what do we do with the participants? Do we put them in the fridge? And is it ethical not to
it
serve
was
them?
about ethics. Since always it was about ethics. Good that it only took me 8 years to realize that.
Lucky you. Took me more than 20 years, but better late than nothing.
Yeah. So, Joanna, you have my slides. I'm very happy if you share them with whoever really is interested. And I hope the participants will also find it useful as a reminder. I think I'm gonna disconnect. I have a meeting in 2 minutes and I do need some water. So
yeah,
that's what I have left. So
yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, and speak soon.
Thank you.
Bye.